Picture this. You wake up on a wooden platform in the middle of the ocean. No phone, no compass, no little blue dot telling you where you are. Just water in every direction all the way to the edge of the world, and somehow you're expected to find a speck of land smaller than a parking lot, thousands of miles away. Most of us would just lie down and accept our fate as fish food, but for thousands of years, actual human beings did this on purpose, for fun, for trade, for survival, and they did it so well that they populated almost every corner of the planet before anyone had ever heard of a satellite. We live in a world where people get lost in a shopping mall with a phone in their pocket that's connected to 24 satellites orbiting the Earth at 17,000 miles an hour. Meanwhile, a guy in a canoe 1,000 years ago looked at the sky, sniffed the wind, watched which way the birds were flying, and calmly sailed 2,000 miles to an island he'd never seen, based on directions his grandfather told him around a campfire. No paper, no GPS, no little arrow saying recalculating. Just a brain absolutely stacked with information passed down like a family recipe, except if you got the recipe wrong, you didn't ruin dinner, you died in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. So how did they do it? How did people cross oceans, deserts, tundras, and mountain ranges without a single map, without writing half the time, and somehow end up more accurate than a lot of early European explorers who had actual charts and instruments? The answer is stranger, and honestly cooler than you'd expect. And it's going to make you look at your phone's dead battery a little differently next time you're stuck without directions. Let's start in the Pacific, because if there's a final boss of ancient navigation, it's the people who settled Polynesia. We're talking about an area of ocean so large it could swallow every continent on Earth and still have room left over, dotted with islands so small that missing one by a few degrees means sailing into absolutely nothing for the rest of your life. And yet, over the course of a few thousand years, Polynesian voyagers found and settled islands from Hawaii to New Zealand to Easter Island, a triangle of oceans so massive it's basically a third of the planet's surface. They did this in canoes. Double-hulled canoes, sure, cleverly engineered, but still canoes powered by sails and paddles with no metal, no writing, and definitely no satellite uplink. Their system is called wayfinding, and it is, without exaggeration, one of the most impressive intellectual achievements in human history, even though it never gets taught in school next to the pyramids or the Colosseum. Wayfinding meant memorizing an entire mental map of the sky, not glancing at the stars for vibes, but tracking the exact points on the horizon where specific stars rose and set, night after night, for the entire path of a voyage. As the Earth rotates, a star will always rise from roughly the same point on the horizon. So if you know your target island lies in the direction where, say, a certain star climbs out of the sea, you steer toward that star until it gets too high in the sky to be useful, then switch to the next star scheduled to rise from that same spot. It's basically a cosmic relay race, and navigators memorized dozens, sometimes over 100, stars and their rising points, along with the seasons they were visible, which is the kind of thing that would make most of us tap out after memorizing 3. But stars only work at night, and clouds exist, annoyingly, so wayfinders needed backups. During the day, they read ocean swells like sheet music. Big oceanic swells are surprisingly consistent in direction over huge distances. Created by distant, steady wind patterns, and an experienced navigator could feel the rhythm of the waves hitting the hull, sometimes lying down in the canoe to physically feel the pitch and roll and tell you which direction they were coming from with their eyes closed. Multiple swell systems can cross each other at once, creating a complicated crosshatch pattern on the water's surface. And navigators learned to separate these overlapping patterns the way a sound engineer picks individual instruments out of a busy mix. It's honestly the kind of skill you'd expect from a superhero origin story, except the origin story is just grew up on a canoe and paid attention. Then there's the wildlife. Certain seabirds fly out from land in the morning to fish and return home every evening, so spotting the right species at the right time of day could point a canoe toward hidden land long before it was visible. Some birds have a range of over 100 miles from their nesting islands, which meant navigators effectively had a squadron of feathery scouts working for free, and all they had to do was correctly identify bird behavior at a glance while also steering a canoe through open ocean. Cloud formations mattered too. Islands, especially ones with lagoons, subtly change the color of the underside of clouds above them, due to light reflecting off shallow water, so an experienced eye could spot a greenish tint on a distant cloud and know there was land underneath it long before any coastline appeared. Even the color and temperature of the water, the presence of certain fish or floating debris, carried information if you knew how to read it. And here's the part that really should be more famous. All of this knowledge, the star paths, the swell patterns, the bird behaviors, the seasonal timing, was passed down entirely through oral tradition, often using chants, songs, and structured teaching tools like the meadow, a woven framework of shells and sticks used in the Marshall Islands to represent swell patterns for training purposes, essentially a hands-on model you could study before ever setting foot on a canoe. Imagine studying for your driver's test using a woven basket that represents the physics of highway traffic patterns, and then acing your first drive across an ocean. This knowledge nearly vanished. By the 20th century, colonization, disease, and the introduction of Western navigation had all but wiped out active wayfinding traditions across most of Polynesia. It survived in only a few places, most famously with a master navigator from the tiny island of Satawal, who became one of the last living people trained in the full traditional system. In the 1970s, he helped train a new generation of Hawaiian navigators and sailed a reconstructed voyaging canoe from Hawaii to Tahiti using nothing but wayfinding. No instruments at all, proving definitively that this wasn't folklore or exaggeration. It was a legitimate, precise, learnable system that modern people could still use to cross thousands of miles of open ocean successfully. That single voyage kicked off a cultural renaissance that's still going strong today, with new generations training in the same star paths their ancestors used, which is honestly one of the great comeback stories in human history, and somehow still isn't a Netflix documentary yet. Now let's hop oceans, both literally and figuratively, and talk about the Vikings, because everyone knows the Vikings sailed to places like Iceland, Greenland, and even North America centuries before Columbus showed up and got all the credit in the history books. What's less commonly known is how they pulled off long crossings through the North Atlantic, an area famous for fog, storms, and weeks where the sun simply refuses to show up. The sun compass is one piece of the puzzle. A simple wooden disc with a central pin that casts a shadow, allowing sailors to track the sun's position and hold a steady course even without seeing land. But the real party trick, and one that sounded like folklore for centuries until scientists took it seriously, is the sunstone. Old sagas mention a mysterious stone that could reveal the sun's position even through thick cloud cover, and for a long time this was written off as a myth, right up until researchers figured out it probably referred to a naturally occurring crystal, likely a form of calcite that polarizes light. When you look through this kind of crystal and rotate it, the way light passes through changes depending on the sun's position relative to you, even if the sun itself is completely hidden behind clouds or fog. Basically, they had a primitive polarized filter made from a rock they found lying around that let them squint at an overcast sky and still figure out roughly where the sun was. That's not folklore, that's borderline superhero equipment mined straight out of the ground. Vikings also paid close attention to wildlife, much like Polynesian navigators did an ocean away with no contact between the two cultures whatsoever, which says a lot about how universal these survival strategies were. Ravens were reportedly carried on some voyages and released when sailors suspected land was near on the logic that the bird would fly toward the nearest coastline, and the crew would simply follow. Whales, seals, and specific fish species also hinted at proximity to land or the presence of underwater features, and experienced sailors built up a mental library of these signs over a lifetime at sea, the same way a modern truck driver develops an instinct for traffic patterns nobody else notices. Let's move from freezing water to blistering sand, because the deserts of Arabia and North Africa presented an entirely different survival puzzle. No coastlines, no swells, no birds pointing you toward an oasis. Just heat, silence, and dunes that can shift positions with the wind, making yesterday's landmarks completely useless today. And yet Bedouin traders crossed these deserts constantly, moving goods, people, and information across distances that would make a modern hiker cry into their overpriced hydration backpack. Stars were, once again, essential, since deserts tend to have famously clear night skies, and traditional desert navigators memorized constellations and used the position of the North Star, or equivalent fixed points depending on the region, to hold a steady bearing through the dark. During the day, when the sky offered less obvious help, navigators relied on an incredibly refined sense of the land itself. Rock formations, the subtle direction dunes, tend to lean based on prevailing winds, the color and texture of different sand types, and even how certain plants grew in relation to buried water sources all became part of a mental library built over a lifetime of desert travel. A skilled guide could reportedly tell how recently a group of travelers had passed through an area just from the condition of footprints or animal tracks, factoring in wind speed and time of day, which is basically the ancient version of forensic science, except the crime scene is an entire sand dune and the only tool is squinting really hard. Camels themselves also became a kind of biological instrument. These animals have an uncanny memory for water sources and routes they've traveled before, and experienced guides often let a camel's instincts guide the group during difficult stretches, essentially treating their transportation as a built-in GPS unit with a bad attitude and questionable spitting habits. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. Now, if deserts and oceans feel intense, let's talk about a landscape that might be the most conceptually wild navigation system on this entire list. Aboriginal Australians developed something called songlines. And if you've never heard of this before, get ready to have your mind gently rearranged. A songline is essentially an oral map encoded into a song, story, or ceremonial performance, tracing the path of an ancestral being's journey across the landscape during what's often referred to as the dreaming. As the song is sung in a very specific order, it names landmarks, water sources, dangers, and directions in the exact sequence a traveler would encounter them on that route. Think about that for a second. Instead of drawing a map on paper, an entire community encoded travel instructions into music, rhythm, and story, structured so that singing the song in the correct order effectively walks you through the landscape step by step. Some of these songlines stretch for hundreds, even thousands of miles, crossing multiple language groups, and remarkably, the melody or rhythm structure can remain consistent even as the actual words shift from one language to another along the route, meaning someone unfamiliar with a local language could still recognize where they were in the journey just from the tune. That's an entire continent's worth of directions, passed down for tens of thousands of years using something that functions less like GPS and more like if Google Maps was also somehow a beautiful piece of music you could sing to your kids. These songlines weren't just for travel either. They carried ecological knowledge, seasonal information about food sources, sacred site locations, and cultural law, all woven into a format that was portable, memorable, and durable across an almost unbelievable span of time. Since some of these traditions are estimated to be tens of thousands of years old, making them some of the oldest continuously used navigational systems on the planet, dramatically older than any written map in human history. Let's head somewhere colder, and honestly, somewhere that seems like it should be. Impossible to navigate at all. The Arctic. If you've ever stood in a snowy field and thought everything looks the same in every direction, imagine that feeling stretched across an entire frozen landscape with no trees, no roads, and near-total whiteout conditions for chunks of the year. Inuit navigators, however, developed an incredibly sophisticated system based on reading the snow itself. Wind consistently shapes snowdrifts into specific patterns called sastrugi, hardened ridges that form in a direction determined by the prevailing wind. Since wind patterns in a given region tend to be relatively consistent over the course of a season, an experienced navigator could look at the orientation of these ridges and instantly understand which direction they were traveling, even in flat, featureless terrain where visual landmarks simply don't exist. It's like reading a giant frozen compass made entirely out of weather data, except instead of a screen, it's just snow. And instead of an app, it's just your eyeballs and years of quiet observation. Stars, again, played a role during clear nights, along with a deep knowledge of animal migration patterns, ice thickness, and coloration, which tells a skilled traveler where it's safe to walk versus where the ice might crack open into freezing water below, and the behavior of specific wildlife that indicated open water, seal breathing holes, or safe travel routes across sea ice. Some Inuit communities also constructed inuksut, stone landmarks built in specific shapes to mark trails, hunting grounds, or safe crossing points, essentially creating a permanent, physical vocabulary of stone that could be read by anyone trained to understand it, all without a single written word. So here's the pattern emerging across every single one of these cultures, separated by oceans, deserts, continents, and thousands of years with zero contact between most of them. None of them had maps in the way we think of maps, printed, portable, drawn to scale. What they had instead was an absolutely staggering depth of observational memory, built collectively over generations and transmitted through story, song, training tools, and mentorship, where a young person would spend years, sometimes decades, apprenticed to an elder before being trusted to navigate alone. This is honestly the biggest twist in the whole story. We tend to imagine ancient people as having less information than us, when in reality, in the specific domains that mattered for their survival, they often had dramatically more usable information than the average modern person, just stored differently. We store our knowledge externally now in phones, apps, satellites, printed charts. They stored it internally in memory, refined and tested and passed down until errors got trained out of the system through sheer necessity, because getting it wrong meant death, not a wrong turn and an annoyed voice recalculating your route. There's also something worth noting about how these systems used redundancy. Nobody relied on just one method. Polynesian wayfinders had stars, swells, birds, and clouds working together. So if one signal disappeared, like the stars vanishing behind cloud cover, 3 other systems were still feeding information. Vikings had the sun compass, sunstones, wildlife behavior, and wave patterns. Desert travelers had stars, terrain reading, animal behavior, and their camel's own memory. This layered redundancy meant these systems were remarkably resilient to bad conditions, which is honestly more than we can say for our modern navigation setup, since most of us are one dead phone battery away from being fully, hopelessly lost in our own neighborhoods. It's worth pausing on just how much training this actually required, because it's easy to romanticize this stuff as some kind of mystical sixth sense, when really it was closer to an apprenticeship in a hardcore scientific discipline. Wayfinders in the Pacific reportedly trained for years, sometimes starting as children, memorizing star paths, swell patterns, and seasonal cues under the direct supervision of a master navigator, with knowledge tested constantly on real, high-stakes voyages, where the consequence of failure wasn't a bad grade, it was drifting into open ocean with no way back. Bedouin guides built their expertise over decades of desert travel, sometimes learning specific stretches of terrain so intimately that they could describe individual rock formations from memory without ever seeing them again for years. This wasn't casual folk wisdom passed around campfires for entertainment, though it absolutely was also passed around campfires. It was rigorous, tested, high-stakes knowledge, refined constantly because bad information got people killed and good information got remembered, retold, and passed forward. There's also a psychological angle to all of this that's honestly underrated. Modern research on wayfinding traditions suggests that constantly relying on external tools like GPS can measurably reduce our natural sense of direction and spatial memory over time, since our brains stop bothering to build internal maps when a device is doing it for us. Meanwhile, cultures that relied entirely on internal navigation systems developed remarkably strong spatial memory and environmental awareness as a simple side effect of their daily survival needs. Their brains had to build the map because there was no alternative, and the map had to be accurate because the ocean, the desert, and the ice do not offer second chances or forgiving margins for error. It's genuinely strange to think that somewhere out there, right now, if traditional wayfinding hadn't nearly gone extinct, there could be teenagers casually memorizing star paths the way we memorize phone numbers. Except star paths are a lot more useful when your phone battery inevitably dies in the middle of a 2,000-mile ocean crossing. Instead, most of us panic if our Maps app buffers for 4 seconds at a red light. None of this is meant to make you feel bad about using GPS, by the way, since modern navigation tools are genuinely incredible and objectively safer for most everyday situations most people find themselves in. But there's something worth appreciating, maybe even something worth reviving a little, in the idea that humans are capable of building extraordinarily sophisticated systems using nothing but observation, memory, and patience, stretched across generations, refined through trial and error, and preserved not in a satellite orbiting the planet, but in the mind of a person willing to teach it to the next one in line. The next time you're stuck somewhere without signal and your phone is sitting there uselessly like an expensive paperweight, take a second and actually look around. Check where the sun is. Notice which way the wind seems to be blowing. See if you can spot any consistent pattern in the clouds, the terrain, or even just the general slope of the ground beneath your feet. You almost certainly won't be able to navigate home using ancient star paths on your first try. And that's completely fine. Nobody expects you to reinvent thousands of years of specialized knowledge in an afternoon. But it's a genuinely fun exercise in imagining just how differently people used to experience the world around them. Back when getting somewhere wasn't a matter of typing an address into a search bar, but a skill built slowly, carefully, and communally. One star, one wave, one grain of sand, one song at a time. And honestly, next time your GPS tells you to make a U-turn in a lake, maybe give a small mental nod of respect to the people who crossed actual oceans with nothing but a woven stick model, a sharp memory, and an almost unreasonable amount of trust in their own grandfather's directions.